Good morning, this is T West, and welcome to Afrisynergy News. Why it was not better for African Americans under and during segregation. Now, I know many of you've heard people talk about and say and write about, African Americans were better under segregation than they are now. You've heard people talk about Martin Luther King Jr. says, before he dies, is killed, that I think we've integrated into a burning house. I've integrated African Americans into a burning house. Now, but you have to think about these things. You really do. You can't just accept certain things simply because someone said it or someone wrote it. Do that, and you shouldn't do that, because let's look back. Okay, let's look back at the segregation era of time. Let's look at it. Think about this now. This was on the tail end. In fact, you had Jim Crow still happening at that time. You still had some lynchings happening at that time. You had extreme, abject poverty of millions of blacks in the United States of America at that time, during segregation now. Okay? Now, I'm going to talk about both sides, because you've always had at least two classes, socioeconomic classes of blacks in the United States. Always. Okay? Now, Martin Luther King Jr. himself did not come from the lower socioeconomic class of African Americans. He did not. He would have been considered middle class, at least middle class. His family, his father was a minister, that whole bit. So he would not have been considered poor. He would not have, as millions of blacks at that time, gone to sleep hungry. He would not have had a mother wondering, where is my child's next meal coming from? He would not have had a mother in the kitchen putting together flour and then putting water in it and then seasoning it to make a little gravy, a little something, so that the children could have something to eat on. Okay? That was not Martin Luther King Jr. A certain class of blacks did not experience abject poverty. And you still have the classes today. You have middle-class blacks, you have upper middle-class blacks, you have rich blacks, and you have a few wealthy blacks. Wealthy blacks, okay, who would that be? That would be people like Oprah Winfrey, Bob Johnson, and a few others. Okay, Michael Jordan, basketball player. Those would be the wealthy ones. Now, so let's go on back again to the segregation era of time. During segregation, what you had a class of black men and women who were wealthy. Okay, just as you have a class of black men and women who are wealthy today. And some of them are wealthy today because they still tap into almost a sole source of supplying certain things to black consumers. During segregation, black businessmen and women had an exclusivity with the African American population. And the African American population at that time, once again, as I said, was very impoverished. Very. Children going to sleep or going to school hungry, it affects their ability to learn. We all know that. It affects the ability to learn. to focus, to concentrate. You know, you hear this term today, ADD, attention deficit disorder and all. Well, hey, look, you know, ever since the Civil War ended, and then coming on into the 1960s, you've had ADD with a hell of a lots of African American children because they were hungry. They could not focus oftentimes if they were in school. And lots of times prior to the 1960s, a hell of a lots of black folk children did not even go to school, or they went to school sporadically. Sometimes the parents would let them go to school. Other times that child would need to help work, to do work on the farm or sharecropping. This was the reality of that day and era. But once again, not all blacks were poor like that. You had those who made lots of money off of other blacks. You know, morticians, because white folks would not bury black folks. So morticians had an exclusivity of burying black folks. And not only with morticians, there were other things. The area of barbers and salons for hair and all. White folks at that time would not touch black folks' hair. They had been duped into thinking that, oh, well, no, there's something wrong right there. Well, you don't want to touch that. Okay? So blacks had an exclusivity. So when you talk about blacks who did well, it was often because of situations and scenarios like I just explained. So segregation meant, yes, you had exclusive black stores where black folks went to shop because white folks did not allow you to go shopping in their stores. Black restaurants, white folks did not allow you to eat in their restaurants. That was segregation now. But it did help segregation. It did help a certain class of blacks. It would have been the class that Martin Luther King Jr. himself was in. So therefore, the pressure later on with Martin Luther King Jr., I think we integrated into a burning house. Now, what did we have right there? You would have seen and heard, if you were Martin Luther King Jr., you would have heard pressure from members within his socioeconomic class because now blacks were going to other restaurants. They were doing business with other businesses. They could go to Woolworth, which is no longer in business, but that was one of the big stores at that time, Woolworth. They could go to J.C. Penney's. They could shop in all of those places, whereas in many cases, they were segregated from in the past. They could not go to those places. So when we talk about and we try to fight and challenge what Martin Luther King Jr. accomplished, then you need to look at the whole equation, the entire equation. When Martin Luther King Jr. sat down, now Martin Luther King Jr. was a Republican. Some of you are turned off when I say that. He was indeed a Republican. But some of the older, much older, if they're still living right now, blacks, they know what I'm talking about because they remember that their parents were Republican. They weren't Democrats. That did not happen until the 1960s, where blacks totally jumped over to become Democrats. And there was a reason why that happened. And I've stated this before, but sometimes it is repetition that finally gets the attention of some people. Okay? But it was the deal that a Republican black made with a racist Republican Democrat white, a Democrat white, I say Republican, but a Democrat white Lyndon B. Johnson being that person, Martin Luther King Jr. made a deal with Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, Candace Owens talk about Lyndon B. Johnson and how welfare destroyed blacks. Well, welfare did not destroy blacks. That is a popular talking line, speaking line of many, many Republicans. And Candace even said in that Revolt Summit debate, I'm not a Republican. She did. She was rattled. And that's when she said that. Now I'm doing just a little snapshots of that Revolt debate. And I haven't gotten to that part yet, where Candace says, I'm not a Republican. Okay? You know, I pay attention to details. That's what I do, to details, because it is in the details where you get the essence of anything. It is where you build from. But let's go on back to Lyndon B. Johnson and Martin Luther King Jr. Lyndon B. Johnson made a deal with Martin Luther King Jr. And that deal involved what millions of African American mothers were experiencing in the 1960s. And what were they experiencing, these black mothers? They were wondering always, where is the next meal for my children going to come from? That is what these black mothers were worried about. Where's the next meal going to come from? Now, you have the other class of blacks, Martin Luther King Jr.'s group. They weren't wondering about these things. They were relatively well-to-do. They had meals, you know, they could eat when they wanted to eat and all. But you had millions across this country, black families, who did not have that. So King, who tapped into the poor, those Sediti, Uppity, Boule, many of those in Atlanta, where King came from, and other cities across America, they did not subscribe to what King was trying to do initially. They did not buy into it. So many of them, many preachers, pastors, business leaders, black business leaders, many of them did not buy into it. Some did, many didn't. Some entertainers, they bought into it. They helped. Aretha Franklin, James Brown, Cassius Clay, known as Muhammad Ali. Others, they bought into it because what they did, they contributed to the cause of what Martin Luther King Jr. was trying to do. They sent money. They supported it. They didn't wait for government tax dollars to support it. They did it themselves. These black men and women of every socioeconomic class, they did it themselves. As well, you had black men and women of a higher socioeconomic class who found Martin Luther King Jr., what he was doing, as detrimental to them. Because remember, as I said in the beginning, they had an exclusivity. They had a captive market, and that market were black folk who could go nowhere else. They had to deal with these black businesses. They had to, good or bad. And some of these businesses were great, offered great services. Some of them were not so great, but yet, hey, where you gonna go? You only have me to deal with. Okay? So you had that situation right there, the exclusivity, one of the characteristics of segregation. So, but yet, the overarching aspect of segregation in that era of time, you know, discrimination, Jim Crow, some black folks were still sharecropping, was that there were millions of black families going hungry. And that is what King saw as being most important, not the elite blacks. And some of them had a problem with that. They had a problem with that because they saw it as, hey, look, this is going to harm my business. This is going to hurt my business. But there was a greater good. And that was that these mothers needed food for their children. White folks were already getting it. White folks already had access to welfare and all. They already had that. But yet you had a people who had built the great wealth of this country. Not these newcomers coming in constantly from Europe and elsewhere, from Asia and elsewhere. It was primarily black folk who built the infrastructure of this country. That's right, built it. But yet they got nothing for their investment into building this country. Got nothing then and has gotten nothing till this day. When we talk about promise zones, enterprise zones, empowerment zones, most of those down through the decades have been and continue to be sabotaged, where other folk primarily benefit from it and not African Americans. Now, you would have to go out and get the studies to show that, to prove that. And that should be easily done. You could easily do that. But that is what you have to do when you present your case. Your case for restitution, your case for reparations. That is what you would have to do. Now, in this Revolt Summit, put on by P. Diddy, sponsored by AT&T, and I don't like AT&T, by the way, okay? All right, put on by them, did not deal with that big word, reparations. Now, others want to call it something different. They want to call it economic revitalization or something, okay? So that it will be easier for pale-skinned Americans, white folks, to swallow. And even for some of y'all, some black folks, to swallow, okay? But whatever you call it, it's still restitution. It is still paying back those who were never paid, the ancestors who were never paid for what America became. And the question in this Revolt Summit, one of the questions was, when was America great? When? Well, there were different eras of time when America was great. Now, let me just break it down for you, okay? Listen. The United States of America brought your ancestors over here because they were very, very and extremely and extraordinarily good at agriculture, at farming. They knew the ins and outs of all of that. Okay? My youngest daughter is very good at that right now. Makes a lot of money doing that. Okay? All right? The gardening, all that. Okay? It's in the genes. Okay? Now, so Africans were very good at that. Your people who came over here, whether you call yourself African American, Hebrews, or whatever you call yourself, I don't get into all of that, okay? I don't. Those are side issues, okay? All right? I go surgically for the heart, the jugular, the main life source, okay? So, but African Americans, what did you do? You built the great wealth of the United States of America, as I wrote in 1989 in the first book that I ever wrote, which was entitled New World Order, AIDS, Genocide, and Theology. And I had one chapter in 1989 that was on reparations, specifically on reparations. 1989 now, okay? Reparations is not a new thing. All right, it's not a new thing. So each generation needs to take it further and further, however. Each generation. Now, and you don't attack the former generation. You don't attack the former generation unwarrantedly, okay, unnecessarily. You don't do that, okay? Now, so America, the United States of America, its first claim to fame and wealth was the agriculture. The agricultural revolution led to the industrial revolution, led to the computer revolution, led to the nanotechnology and digitalization revolution that we see today. As, who was it? Bill Withers? Nothing from nothing leaves nothing. You got to have something. Okay, you got to have a seed. You got to have that wealth to start this thing going. So when was America great? Okay, it was great during the agricultural revolution. It was great when many states in this country, when cotton was king. It was so great that white folks knew that it was black folks who were responsible for their magnificent wealth. Magnificent wealth, especially in many of the southern states. They knew it was black folk. And it was black folk, whose faces white folks printed on their money at that time. That's right. Not on the dollar bill today. You know, y'all talking about and debating about and having a a fuss and a fight over Donald Trump and Harriet Tubman being on the $20 bill or whatever, $50 bill, whatever. Okay, all right, but listen, hey, look, come on, let's focus. Not that little stuff. All right. So, but your ancestors, it was their images that was printed on the money. That was a level of honesty by white folks at that time. Indicating that it was your ancestors, who were and are responsible for their immense wealth. Cotton is king. The agricultural revolution. Now, that was before the Civil War, but that was one era of time. But then there came another era of time when America was great. When was that? It was not the 1920s. Somebody said, and they were wrong, that it was great when there was Black Wall Street in Oklahoma. Oh, no. We're not talking about white America. No. White Americans attacked those blacks because those blacks were doing better than most of them. With Black Wall Street, the 1920s. They attacked them. Okay? So when was America, talking about a white America, when was it great? I've given you the first era of time. Here's the second era of time. The second era of time when white America and America in general was great, but excluding African Americans was great, was the 1960s and prior, the so-called Great Society. Are you following me? The so-called Great Society, where black folk had come almost to their wits' end, where black folk had to do something. And then that was the birth of Martin Luther King Jr. That was the birth of Malcolm X. That was the birth, a little before Martin and Malcolm, was the birth of Elijah Muhammad. That was the response to America's greatness, where they were extracting more and more off of black people. Taxation, but there was no representation. There were no black members in Congress. None, as there were in the 1860s following the Civil War, where you had a record number of black men in Congress, in the U.S. House, in the U.S. Senate. But we're not talking about when was African Americans great? Collectively and overall, African Americans have never been great in the United States of America. And that's why I produced this cap. MAAG. What is that? Make African Americans Great. Now, on my recent trip, and you can buy that, it's $25, okay? But on my recent trip to Ghana, our tour guide was wearing a red cap, and it said MAAG, but it meant Make Africa Great Again. Not Make America Great Again, but Make Africa Great Again. Okay, so when we talk about when America was great, all the way up through the 1960s, 1920s, no. America wasn't great then. There was a period of time before the 1920s where you had a lots of hustle, bustle, and growth and everything. But then you had the Great Crash. You had where everything went down. Okay, it crashed. The Great Depression. You had that. So in the 1960s, 1950s, white Americans were doing great. You had mostly a majority white men out making the money, doing the work. And the white women, for the most part, they didn't even have to work because the white men were getting all the money. And the white women, they could stay home, raise the children, do all of that, leave it to Beaver, all in the family type situation. Okay? So, when we talk about African Americans, and when we talk about segregation, and some of you pine for, you long for, and you don't know what you're pining and longing for, the days of segregation. Oh, when we need to rotate the black dollar. Okay? All right. But you don't understand and know the essence of all of that. Now, yes, you need to do that. Yes, you need to rotate the dollar within your communities more where there are communities. In most areas across this country, there are no black communities. Okay? Okay? You create communities with numbers. The Hispanics are doing that. The Hispanics are moving into the South, the southern states, in big numbers. Been doing that for 2 decades. But you all have not been listening. You all have not been paying attention. A few of you have. Yeah. You see it. You see it. Where you are in the South, you see it. New Orleans, you see it. Arkansas, you see it. Alabama, you see it. Louisiana, you see it. But what are you doing about it? What are you doing about it? In California, the blacks who are there, who are still there, you complain. Well, look at the Hispanic population. Look at they're taking over this, they're taking over that. Yes, because they have the numbers. They are moving as a monolith. They communicate with each other and they say, we're going to produce numbers. Numbers means population. We're going to increase our numbers in this area and then we're going to take over. We're going to take over politically. Get the laws and ordinances that we want. If they want to ticket us for having our vans and our cantinas, vehicles selling things on the streets and all, we're going to change the ordinance. We're going to change the law. We're going to turn, if it's illegal immigration or illegal aliens, we're going to change the law. We're going to make this a sanctuary city. We're going to make it a sanctuary county. We're going to make it a sanctuary state. And ultimately, we want to make America totally a sanctuary country. A country without borders. No borders. No borders. And allow us to come in huge numbers and take over. Open borders. Now, but let's get right back to this whole segregation thing because I want to close this down. Segregation. Segregation. That is not an era of time that you want to go back to. Now you can have what some of you talk about. But you got to, and you need to listen to what I'm saying. There are battles in certain areas, certain states, certain regions that are lost. And some of you are still trying to fight the doggone battle. You're still trying to do that. And that's ignorance. That's foolishness. That's stubbornness. You must create your numbers in a region of this country. Now, many, many years ago, I did a program and I talked about the South. I talked about the South being the black Mecca. I talked about a de facto nation state. That's what the Hispanics are doing. They're doing that. They're creating de facto nation states, along with the help of some of the Asian groups. If you're talking about California, if you're talking even about Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts. Okay? A de facto states, African Americans. 39% of you, 39%, which is the largest regional percentage of black folk in this country. 39% of you still live and reside in the southern states. Now I know some of you are saying right now, hell no, T. West. Hell no, T. West. I don't want to have anything to do with the South. Those are the ones who are stubborn. Okay, you're stubborn. Okay, Hispanics aren't like that. You can talk about the Hispanics and what they do and how successful they are and on and on and on. And Hispanics don't go out there talking and using the term white supremacy, white supremacy, white supremacy. The Asians don't go out there using the term white supremacy, white supremacy, white supremacy. They just kick y'all's asses. Period. That's what they're doing. Okay? All right? They're not teaching an inferiority complex to you while selling themselves to you with this whole white supremacy nonsense. Okay, which was the word, the code word, the firebomb that T.I. used to throw off the debate at the Revolt Summit. These are code words. And I knew exactly what he was doing when he did it. And it rattled Katrina and Candace. It rattled them. All right. You have to know and understand the techniques in debates. You have to know and understand what your opposition is going to use against you. And then be prepared to compensate for it, to answer to it, to quieten down and hush the crowd, which is in opposition to you. You have to be able to do that. Now, so with this whole segregation, with a de facto nation state, de facto means that you've got the damn numbers. You've got the voting power. No matter how they try to jerry-rig and gerrymander an area, you are so concentrated with your numbers that there is no means of gerrymandering. I don't care how you try to snake through. You've got it covered. This is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about. You as African Americans, as Hebrews, whatever you choose to call yourselves, as Moors, okay, on and on down the line, whatever you choose to call yourself, you must concentrate your numbers. And I'm not talking about New York City either. No. I'm not talking about that. You will never have the numbers in New York City. Never, ever. I'm talking about a strategic great migration. Strategic. Okay? Now, do I spend all of my precious time bringing this to you just to talk to you? No. There is a reason and a purpose for this, for why I spend the time speaking this. Who else is saying it? Who else? You followed certain agendas, certain guidelines, certain people for many, many years. How far and how much has it moved you all forward collectively? Notice I didn't say just you. You always have the elite, the talented 10th. You will always have that. But what about the base? What about the collective? The talented 10th will use the base, that is the millions of you, will use the grassroots to promote their own socioeconomic interests. Jesse Jackson did it. Al Sharpton did it. And possibly, my brother, what's his name? Comcast? The lost $20 billion lawsuit against Comcast? He could do the same thing. Byron Allen. They'll use you all, your voices and all, to situate themselves in a pinnacle position and sustain themselves in that pinnacle position, but yet they have not promised anything to you. They have not put down on paper anything with regards to what you are going to get out of it and what the numbers will be. How many of you will benefit from it? They've not done that. They don't do that. Okay? Just putting some thoughts in your heads. In your heads. As I said, you will always and have always had the talented 10th among black folks. And some among the talented 10th will use you all, the rest of you. Martin Luther King Jr., he defied that profile. He didn't do that. He didn't do it. And paid the ultimate sacrifice for it, his life. So when some of you come and say what Martin Luther King Jr. did was stupid, it was idiotic. No, it was not. It was not. Because there were millions. I'm going to close where I started. There were millions of black mothers across this country whose children were hungry. And when they go to school, these children hungry, it affects their concentration. This is T West with Afrisynergy News.